And he actually offers us an analysis, doesn't he, of this particular kind of being or way of being that we are, which relates it directly to time, and hence the title of his most famous book. Can you explain what that relationship is?
Yes, we better spell that out. The relationship of, another word that's handy here, this relationship of opening a clearing, because another word for the situation is a clearing. And there is this activity of clearing this clearing, which we are. And he says this activity has a threefold structure. First, he says, Dasein has what he calls disposition, the best example of which is moods. That is, thanks to a basic characteristic of us, things show up for us as mattering, as threatening or attractive or stubborn or useful and so forth.
Or just important in some way.
Or important in some way. And the tradition has generally overlooked that, he thinks, because it doesn't easily fall into these knowing interests. But he says, of course, rightly, that it's very important that things show up for us as mattering. And they do because we have this basic characteristic called disposition. And we're always already in a situation, and it always already matters some way. We don't ever get behind our moods and start from no mood and then step into one. The second structure he calls discourse, which is a little bit misleading, but it grows out of a kind of interesting pun. That is, he says, the world is always articulated. That is, right now, everything is already laid out in this, what he calls context of significance, all pieces of equipment fitting together so that we can use any particular one. And I'm always articulating the world, that is, breaking it up at its joints by using a piece of equipment. If I take out of this total, which he calls a referential or a totality of significance, a hammer, I can articulate it by hammering with it as a hammer, or I can articulate it as a nail puller under different aspects. And then, of course, I can talk about what I'm doing. I can say, this nail is hard to pull. Then I will be articulating even further what I had already articulated. And that's constantly going on. That's called discourse. And the third aspect, which has been implicit in what we've been saying, is that Dasein is always pressing into the future. If I'm hammering with a nail, it's in order to, say, repair a house, in order to do my job as homemaker, say, or carpenter. Dasein, in Heidegger talk, is using equipment in order to pursue some goal, which he calls towards which, for the sake of some ultimate, let's say, life plan, which he calls a for the sake of. Now, it's important not to speak about goals and life plans. His funny language is necessary, because a goal is what you have in your mind, or a life plan. Whereas he just says Dasein is always oriented toward the future, doing something now in order to get to do something later, and that all of this makes sense as oriented toward something which is what that person is up to, and that threefold structure, which is being already in, amidst things, and always ahead of itself, pressing into the future, is, as you let the cat out of the bag, the structure of time. In the second half of being in time, lo and behold, the threefold structure of being in the world, or being in a situation, turns out to be mappable on past, present, and future.
And he ends up saying almost that being is time, doesn't
That's right.
it?
Well, Dasein, anyway.
We are embodied time.
That's right.
Dasein,
in his language, is care, and the structure of care is temporality.
Yeah. Now, we've talked up to this point just about the individual human being, what Heidegger calls Dasein, and its position in the world, and all these various aspects of it that you've been spelling out. But, of course, Heidegger doesn't suppose that he's the only being that exists, and you and I, when we talk about this, don't suppose that you or I are the only beings that exist. The world is full of people. How do all the other people, or the other Daseins, come into this picture?
Well, it's very important that they come in from the very start. In fact, it's a big problem for Cartesians like Descartes and Husserl. They have the same problem about other minds that they have about the external world, because they start with an individual, autonomous, isolated subject. Heidegger starts in an entirely different way, closer to the phenomena and saving him from this problem. He says we all already do what anyone does. I hammer with a hammer because one hammers with hammers in our culture. I eat the way one eats. I pronounce words the way one pronounces words in our country.
And you have to, or you wouldn't be understood.
That's right. And in fact, people subtly, constantly, people can't stand distance, Heidegger says, meaning people subtly lead other people to correct their pronunciation or whatever. And they don't have to be coerced into it. People are eager not to deviate from the norm. It's just a basic fact about human beings. So we grow up, Heidegger doesn't talk genetically, but we could say it helpfully. A baby gets socialized into a bunch of shared public practices and starts doing what one does and saying what one says. And at that point, this baby has Dasein in it to talk like Heidegger. And of course, this one doesn't mean just the masses. As Heidegger says in one point, we flee from the crowd the way one flees from the crowd. But even when we flee from the crowd, we do it the way one does it. So finally, Heidegger says about Dasein that normally Dasein is what it does, or one is what one does, or Dasein's self is a one self.